Karen screams at deaf cashier for ignoring her, then slaps him when he signs back. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The crowded supermarket was a reflection of the bustling shopping center outside, with aisles packed with customers pushing carts filled to the brim with everything from fresh produce to canned goods. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed as the faint hum of chatter echoed through the store, punctuated by the occasional clatter of shopping carts and the jingling of coins. At the front of the store, the line at the checkout counter was steadily growing, with people impatiently shifting from one foot to the other as they waited for their turn to pay. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the kind where everyone seemed to be rushing to finish their errands before the weekend would slip away. In the middle of this ordinary chaos stood Jamie, a young man in his mid-20s, standing behind the register and scanning items with a practiced hand. Jamie had been working at the grocery store for about 2 years, and though his job wasn't glamorous, he took pride in it. The store was busy, but he was calm, his eyes flicking between the screen of his register and the customers who came through. He had learned to adapt to the rhythm of the supermarket, moving quickly through his tasks while maintaining a friendly but professional demeanor. However, there was one thing that made his job a bit more challenging than others: Jamie was deaf. Despite his hearing impairment, Jamie had never let it hinder his work. He had learned to read lips, use sign language, and write down notes to communicate with customers. He had also become quite good at using his hands to point out signs or gestures to help people understand what he was trying to say. His colleagues were supportive, and they had all learned a few key phrases in American Sign Language, ASL, to assist him. For the most part, things worked smoothly, and customers rarely gave him trouble. But today, as the line grew longer, Jamie would encounter someone who wasn't as understanding. Karen was a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a trendy, oversized sweater and carrying a designer handbag that looked a little out of place in the grocery store. She was the type of customer who was always in a hurry, her face often scrunched up in a permanent expression of impatience. As she walked down the aisle, she quickly scanned her cart to ensure everything was in order before heading to the checkout counter. When she arrived, Jamie was standing behind the register, scanning another customer's items with a quiet concentration. She sighed as she looked at the line and then rolled her eyes at the fact that there were only 2 cashiers working. Finally, Karen muttered under her breath, her impatience starting to show. She pushed her cart forward with a sense of urgency, as though the moment she reached the counter, the entire world would change. Jamie acknowledged her with a slight smile, keeping his focus on the register, but Karen immediately noticed something that irritated her. He hadn't greeted her with a verbal hello or "how can I help you," which, for Karen, was a glaring oversight in customer service. She cleared her throat loudly, trying to get his attention, but Jamie remained focused on the task at hand. He could see her in his peripheral vision, but he was intent on the work in front of him, continuing to scan the groceries. Karen's expression faltered as she shifted her gaze to the cashier and then back to her items, assuming that Jamie was somehow ignoring her. She had seen people distracted by their phones before, and it was always frustrating, but this time it felt different. There was something about his complete lack of response that made her feel as though he wasn't even trying to acknowledge her presence. "Excuse me," Karen snapped, raising her voice louder than necessary, clearly irritated. "Are you just going to ignore me, or are you going to do your job?" Jamie was taken aback. He hadn't heard her voice, and from the look on her face, he knew she was upset. He turned to face her and smiled politely, giving a slight wave of his hand in the universal sign of greeting. He reached for the notepad he kept at his station to write down a message for her, trying to communicate as best he could. The words on the paper were simple: "I'm deaf. How can I help you?" He offered her the notepad with a slight tilt of his head, hoping to ease the tension. Karen stared at the notepad for a moment before narrowing her eyes at him. She scanned the paper, then glared back at Jamie with a look of disbelief. Her face reddened, and she looked around the store as if waiting for someone else to notice the situation. Her frustration quickly turned to anger. "So now you can't even speak," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think that makes it okay to ignore paying customers? You're a cashier, not a mute." The harshness of her tone caught Jamie off guard. He was used to dealing with people who were confused or surprised when they first saw him sign or use his notepad, but no one had ever spoken to him so cruelly before. He could feel the sting of her words, but he tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he was just doing his job the best way he knew how. Karen's eyes flicked to the line of customers behind her, who were now awkwardly shifting in place. Her voice grew louder as she continued, her tone becoming more accusatory. "It's your job to help me, and you should be doing it properly. This is ridiculous." Her hands flew up in the air as if she were being inconvenienced by the mere presence of a deaf cashier. She stood there, waiting for Jamie to respond, but instead, he simply offered another note, this time more direct. "Please wait while I finish." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. She looked at the notepad again, clearly annoyed at the situation, but now it was more than just irritation, it was indignation. She had been in plenty of stores before and had never been treated this way. How could someone be allowed to work in customer service without speaking? And why hadn't anyone warned her about this before she stood in line? This wasn't how things were supposed to go, and she wasn't about to let it slide. She opened her mouth to say something else, but before the words could leave her lips, Jamie glanced up, noticing her growing impatience. With his hands now poised in the air, he attempted to sign to her. He made sure to slow down his movements, hoping she would understand. "I am happy to help." "Please wait," he signed slowly, hoping that his clear, deliberate gestures would communicate his willingness to assist. But instead of accepting the explanation or trying to understand, Karen's anger only intensified. She crossed her arms over her chest and huffed, muttering something under her breath. "Unbelievable," she whispered sharply. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was becoming clear that this encounter would be anything but routine. As the moments ticked by, the tension in the air continued to rise. Jamie could feel the weight of Karen's gaze, her impatience and frustration simmering just below the surface, but he was determined not to let the situation escalate further. He had been working as a cashier for long enough to know how to handle difficult customers, and he was trying his best to remain calm despite the harsh words and glares being thrown his way. But Karen wasn't letting up. With every passing second, she seemed to grow more agitated, and the scene around them grew even more uncomfortable. The line behind Karen, once patient, now felt the ripple effects of her increasingly loud and accusatory voice. "Seriously? This is how you treat customers?" "Unbelievable," Karen continued, her voice rising in volume as she spoke, clearly hoping to be heard by everyone in the store. She cast an angry glance around at the other people waiting in line, as though trying to rally them to her side. The few people in the queue seemed to shift uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether to speak up or remain silent. The situation, which had started as just another trip to the store, was now spiraling into something far more dramatic, and it was evident that Karen wasn't backing down. Jamie, however, did his best to ignore the increasing spectacle. He wasn't angry at her, he wasn't even upset. He simply felt an overwhelming sense of disappointment, not in her behavior necessarily, but in how easily things had gotten out of hand. All he had tried to do was help. His hands moved slowly, and with each sign he made, he hoped she would understand, but the expression on her face told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't even trying. He had hoped that once he communicated his deafness to her, the situation might calm down, that Karen would at least acknowledge his attempt to engage, but instead, she was doubling down on her accusations. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't willing to hear any of it. To her, it was as if the very act of not being acknowledged the way she expected was a personal affront. She had always prided herself on being treated with a certain level of respect, and now, in her eyes, she was being ignored and belittled by the cashier in front of her. She was used to the world bending to her will, her demands always met with the service she expected, but today, Jamie's silence felt like a rejection, an insult that could not go unpunished. "Do you think you're better than me because you don't have to speak? Do you think I'm just supposed to sit here and deal with this?" She ranted. Her voice was loud and sharp, clearly laced with anger. "You know what? Forget it. I don't even want to deal with you anymore," she continued, her face contorting with indignation. She began to grab her items from the counter, not even waiting for Jamie to finish scanning them. She was done, or at least, she thought she was. Her frustration had reached a boiling point, and she didn't care about the other customers in line who were now watching the scene unfold. For her, this was no longer just about getting through her checkout. It was a matter of pride. But Jamie didn't move. He continued to stand there, watching her, waiting for the situation to de-escalate, but it was clear that Karen had no intention of letting it go. He noticed her hands trembling with anger as she grabbed her bags, throwing a glance at the line of customers behind her, most of whom were now anxiously watching the scene. One customer, a young man in his 20s, shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other, unsure whether to step in and say something, but ultimately deciding against it. After all, it wasn't his battle to fight. It seemed like everyone in the vicinity had opted for silence, perhaps in an effort to avoid becoming part of the drama themselves. Karen, however, was anything but silent. She was on a warpath now, her words sharper and more biting with every passing moment. "You people are all the same, just lazy and rude, thinking you can get away with anything," she yelled. Her voice echoed through the store, reverberating off the shelves and giving the entire store a sense of awkward discomfort. Jamie could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. His hands trembled slightly, but he refused to let his composure slip. His expression was calm, though his mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Why was she so angry? Was it just about him not speaking? Or was it something deeper, something far beyond the confines of this interaction? Jamie continued to write on his notepad, a calm, collected response to the escalating scene. He handed it to her, this time writing, "I apologize for any confusion. How can I help?" His handwriting was neat, precise, a reflection of his personality. He knew that some customers had a hard time understanding his communication style, but he hoped that his words would at least be enough to clarify things. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to escalate the situation any further. He just wanted to do his job. But Karen wasn't interested in his apology. She wasn't interested in the message he was trying to send. All she saw was a cashier who had disrespected her, a perceived slight that she could not ignore. "You think a stupid piece of paper is going to fix this? You think you can just write things down and make everything better? No, that's not how this works." Karen shouted, the anger in her voice now unmistakable. She grabbed her purse tightly, clutching it as if it were some sort of weapon to defend herself against the perceived injustice that was unfolding before her. The other customers in the store remained as still as statues, most of them trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves, but a few exchanged worried looks. One elderly woman, who had been standing near the front of the line, turned away and began to shuffle towards another register, as though she couldn't bear to witness the conflict any longer. At that moment, Karen's voice broke through the silence, a sharp, piercing accusation that seemed to cut through the air. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? You think this is funny, don't you?" she yelled, her voice now a shrill screech of frustration. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes wide, almost wild with emotion. The entire situation had spiraled out of control, and Karen wasn't about to stop until she had won, or at least, in her mind, forced Jamie into some kind of submission. She was convinced that he was purposefully ignoring her, disrespecting her, and no amount of reason or explanation would convince her otherwise. Jamie took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but this was something entirely different. He had never encountered someone so hostile, so set on misunderstanding him. He tried once again to communicate, but before he could even make a gesture, Karen's face twisted into something even darker. She was no longer just angry, she was livid, and there was no telling what would happen next. The temperature in the air seemed to rise as her frustration reached a boiling point, and Jamie had a sinking feeling that things were about to take a turn for the worse. He could only brace himself for what was to come. Jamie stood there, a mixture of disbelief and resignation washing over him as Karen's words echoed through the store, reverberating against the walls. He had been patient, calm, and understanding, but it seemed that nothing he could say or do would break through the wall of anger that surrounded her. As she continued to rant, her face contorted in rage, her eyes wild with frustration, Jamie could feel his own frustration beginning to rise, though he was determined not to let it show. He had been in situations like this before, people who misunderstood, people who were rude, but never had he encountered someone so insistent on maintaining their misplaced anger. The moment she yelled at him again, Jamie took another step back, his body language calm but his mind racing. He had long ago learned to control his emotions, to compartmentalize the tension and the heat that surged within him whenever someone made assumptions or treated him with disrespect. But the louder Karen got, the more he realized that she was beyond reason. She wasn't interested in understanding his situation or hearing his side. She wasn't concerned with anything except her own belief that she had been wronged. Her sense of entitlement and disregard for his circumstances made it clear that the path to resolution was no longer possible. In a final act of defiance, Karen's hands flew up in the air, and she slapped the counter in front of her with such force that it startled several customers who were still in line. "You're unbelievable," she screamed, as if her outburst would somehow make Jamie see the error of his ways. "You think just because you're different, you can treat people like this?" Her voice trembled with a mix of outrage and hurt, though Jamie couldn't tell if the hurt was real or simply a projection of her own feelings of injustice. He had tried to explain himself, to offer her a moment of clarity, but each attempt had only seemed to fuel her fire. There was no reasoning with someone who refused to listen. Jamie's mind raced as he glanced down at the notepad in his hand. He knew he needed to do something. He had to stop this from escalating further, but what could he do? How could he make Karen understand when she was so entrenched in her own perception of the situation? The other customers had begun to murmur among themselves, the tension palpable. Some were sympathetic, their eyes glancing between Jamie and Karen, while others were more uncomfortable with the unfolding scene, unsure whether to step in or simply remain silent. A few bystanders had already pulled out their phones, no doubt ready to record the entire interaction, but Jamie wasn't focused on them. He was only concerned with de-escalating the situation. As if on cue, Karen's temper boiled over in an instant. Without warning, her hand shot forward, slapping Jamie's wrist with a quick, sharp motion. The sting of her palm against his skin shocked him, but it wasn't the physical pain that registered, it was the humiliation, the complete disregard for his dignity as a person. His heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, he was frozen in place, the sound of the slap still echoing in his ears. It wasn't just a slap, it was an assault on his very being, a denial of his humanity, an action that spoke volumes about how Karen viewed him in that moment. The other customers around them were now whispering loudly among themselves, some even recoiling at the audacity of Karen's action. Jamie's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, though he quickly pushed the emotions aside, determined not to lose control. He glanced at his hand, the sting of her slap still lingering, but he didn't allow himself to show weakness. Instead, he slowly raised his eyes to meet Karen's, his expression still calm, though his gaze hardened slightly. The tension between them was unbearable, the air thick with a hostility that had not been there before. Karen's chest heaved with heavy breaths, her anger still boiling beneath the surface as she stood there, daring Jamie to respond. For a moment, the world seemed to pause around them. The customers in line, those who had been watching the scene unfold, all seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how Jamie would react. Would he fight back? Would he let her words and actions break him? But instead of giving in to the impulse to shout, to lash out, Jamie did something he hadn't expected to do. He lowered his gaze, taking a deep, steadying breath. In that brief moment, he realized that he couldn't change Karen's mind. No matter how much he wanted to explain, no matter how much he wanted to make her see the error of her ways, he knew that it would be futile. She had already made up her mind about him, and no amount of reason or calmness would shatter her perception of what was happening. Instead of reacting with anger, Jamie did the one thing that felt most natural, he withdrew. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the notepad again, his fingers moving deliberately as he wrote down a simple message, "I'm not here to fight. Please stop." His handwriting was steady and composed, the words clear and direct. As he held out the notepad to her, he felt a small surge of relief. It wasn't an attempt to placate her or make her feel like she had won, but rather an attempt to communicate on his own terms, to make her understand that he was simply doing his job. There was nothing more to it than that. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't willing to let go of her anger, not yet. She slapped the notepad out of his hand, sending it fluttering to the floor with a loud thud. The action was so abrupt, so filled with malice, that it took Jamie a moment to process what had just happened. His chest tightened with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Was this really happening? Was she really this determined to make him suffer for something that wasn't his fault? The notepad lay on the floor between them, the message he had written barely legible, a symbol of his attempt to reach out to her, discarded like it meant nothing. Karen's face was twisted with contempt, her body stiff with anger. "Don't you dare try to get all self-righteous with me," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "You've got some nerve, acting like you're above it all just because you can't hear." She was practically shouting now, her hands trembling with the force of her emotion. "You don't know what it's like to deal with people like you, to be treated like this. You think you're the victim here? Well, I'm the victim. You've wasted my time, and now you're trying to make me feel bad for being upset. Get real." The words hit Jamie like a wave crashing against a cliff. For a moment, he felt like he was drowning in the sheer force of her anger. But as he stood there, the weight of her accusations and her slaps still heavy on his skin, something inside him shifted. The empathy he had tried to extend to Karen, the patience he had shown her, was slipping away, replaced by something else, something deeper. He wasn't going to let her diminish him any longer. Not this time. The store manager, Brad, was a large, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s. He had seen his fair share of difficult customers, but nothing quite like this. When he had heard Karen shouting from across the store, his instincts kicked in, and he quickly made his way toward the front registers. The scene that greeted him, however, was far from what he had expected. The air was thick with tension, and the normally calm environment of the checkout area had turned into a public spectacle. Karen was still standing there, her face flushed with anger, while Jamie stood behind the counter, his posture stiff, his eyes lowered, and his hand hovering over the notepad he had written on earlier. The sight of Karen's clenched fists and Jamie's calm demeanor only further highlighted the stark contrast between their emotions, and Brad could tell that things had escalated far beyond a simple misunderstanding. "Ma'am, what's going on here?" Brad's voice was calm, but firm. He had dealt with many confrontations before, but this situation felt different. Karen immediately turned to face him, her face contorting with frustration and disbelief. She seemed almost eager to tell her side of the story, as though this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when someone would finally take her side. "This man," she began, pointing an accusatory finger at Jamie, "is completely disrespecting me. I've been standing here, trying to get his attention for ages, and all he's done is ignore me. I don't know what kind of place this is, but I will not stand for being treated like this." Her voice was rising again, her anger returning in full force. She looked around, as though she expected the other customers to join her in her outrage, but no one seemed to be responding. A few customers had shifted uneasily, and others had even begun to avert their eyes, not wanting to be involved in the confrontation. It was becoming clear that Karen was alone in her fury. Brad took a deep breath and turned his attention to Jamie, who was still standing behind the counter, holding the notepad in his hands. Jamie had his head lowered, but there was a quiet dignity in his posture. He had been working in this store long enough to know how to navigate difficult situations, but this was different. He had been treated unfairly, misunderstood, and ultimately disrespected by someone who refused to listen to reason. Brad could see the strain in Jamie's expression, the exhaustion of trying to remain calm in the face of unwarranted hostility. "Jamie, is everything okay?" Brad asked gently. Jamie didn't immediately respond. Instead, he picked up the notepad and began to write again, the words flowing slowly and carefully as he composed his thoughts. After a moment, he held the notepad up for Brad to see. "I'm deaf," it read. "I've been trying to communicate with her, but she won't listen." The simplicity of the words hit harder than anything else Jamie could have said. There was no bitterness, no anger in his message, just a quiet statement of fact. Brad glanced at Karen, who seemed momentarily taken aback by the note, her face faltering as the truth began to sink in. For the first time, she stopped shouting, her mouth hanging open as though the words didn't make sense. "He's deaf?" Karen muttered to herself, her voice suddenly much quieter. I didn't know that." Jamie nodded, still holding the notepad in his hand, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the altercation began. There was no malice in his gaze, only a quiet, patient resolve that seemed to say, "I don't want this fight." The silence that hung between them felt heavy now, thick with the weight of Karen's realization. It was a moment of clarity, at least, it should have been. But Karen, unwilling to admit her own error, quickly shifted back into her defensive stance. She folded her arms across her chest, her face hardening again, though not quite with the same intensity as before. "Why didn't he say something?" Karen asked, her voice tinged with a new note of frustration. "Why didn't he let me know that he couldn't hear me?" Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his voice even and measured. "You didn't ask, ma'am. And Jamie did try to communicate with you. He's been trying to help you from the very beginning." He glanced at Jamie, who gave him a small, appreciative nod. Not everyone is able to communicate in the same way. It's important to be patient and understanding with others, especially when they're trying their best. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but she quickly masked it with an attempt at bravado. "Well, I didn't know. How was I supposed to know he couldn't hear me? He should have made it clearer. It's his job to make sure people understand him." Her words were more defensive now, a clear indication that she was still grappling with the realization that she had wronged Jamie. But instead of owning up to her actions, she was clinging to her perception of victimhood. "I shouldn't have to deal with this," she muttered under her breath. Brad took a step closer to Karen, his tone becoming more direct. "Actually, ma'am, it's not Jamie's responsibility to explain his condition to every customer who walks through this door. It's your responsibility to treat others with respect, regardless of whether they communicate like you do or not. Jamie is doing his job, and he's doing it well. What you did, what you said to him, was completely unacceptable." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Brad raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. "I've seen this kind of behavior before, and it won't be tolerated here. If you can't treat our employees with respect, you won't be welcome in this store anymore." His voice was firm, no nonsense, and there was no room for negotiation in his tone. "Now, I suggest you gather your things and leave." For a moment, Karen just stood there, her eyes darting around the store as though looking for someone to support her, to validate her feelings. But the more she searched, the more she realized that no one was on her side. The customers around her had already begun to look away, busying themselves with their own purchases, eager to get back to their shopping. There was no one left to rally behind her, and the reality of the situation hit her like a slap in the face. Slowly, reluctantly, Karen picked up her bags from the counter. She didn't say another word to Jamie or Brad as she turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps loud and deliberate as she left the store. The door swung closed behind her with a soft jingle, and the tension that had built up over the past few minutes seemed to dissipate in an instant. As soon as she was gone, Jamie let out a quiet breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Brad looked over at him, offering a nod of understanding. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Jamie gave him a small smile, his hand still resting on the counter. He didn't need to say anything. His calm demeanor said it all. He was okay. He had weathered the storm, and though the encounter had been difficult, he had come out of it stronger. "Thanks, Brad," Jamie finally said, his voice soft but sincere. "I appreciate it." "No problem," Brad replied with a warm smile. "You handled that with a lot of grace." As the store returned to its normal rhythm, Jamie felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that he had done the right thing. He had tried his best to communicate, to de-escalate the situation, and in the end, he had been supported by those who mattered. He had been respected when it mattered most, and that, more than anything, made all the difference.